Hello, everybody. We are coming in today for it is November 11th. It is Veterans Day here in the United States. In other countries, it is Remembrance Day. And if we are at all the students of history that some of us are, we realize what the true behind the meaning purpose of today was, what it originally was for, and that was Armistice Day, celebrating the armistice that ended the First World War on November 11th of 1918. Now, World War One ended 104 years ago today, at least on the Western Front. It would end definitely by the end of the month. But the armistice was not an official peace treaty. The official peace treaty would not come until the following year in June of 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. And that is going to be the subject of today's video. Now, World War One has always been a topic that I have had great interest in. It's one that I study profusely to see because it's very interesting. It's not in the, to put it bluntly, it's not a typical conflict like World War II. Because of that, it's always befuddled historians all the time. Because World War II, we can very much set up clear defining guidelines as it's between good and evil. Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese Empire at the time, its leaders we're talking about, they were evil. I mean, Hitler murdered over 6 million Jews, let alone how many others that were he deemed undesirable. But World War II has very clearly defined lines over who was good and who was evil. World War I doesn't have that same clarity because there is really no defined good and evil. No one was really good and no one was really evil in World War I. It was simply a clash of different reasons of nationalities, of empires that were just greedy for imperialistic gains, for money. It was not the typical good versus evil conflict. And because of that reason, because you can't classify it in that way, historians have always kind of been befuddled by World War One because there's so many different reasons. We could make a whole nother video, and probably we will one day, about the different reasons that have been discussed for why this war happened. But nonetheless, in a brief summary, the conflict, of course, started in June. Well, not June, but it started in July of 1914. The previous month, in June, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian assassin who the Austrians thought was working for the Serbian government. Now, he was the member of a terrorist organization that had links to the Serbian army, but he was not an agent of the Serbian government. But nonetheless, the Austrians took it as the Serbians were trying to basically attack their right to rule over their lands in the Slavic nations, and they declare war on Serbia. Russia is Serbia's ally, and I think we all know the story. Russia gets involved because it's going to defend Serbia. Germany is Austria's ally, so Germany tells Russia either back off or I'm going to war with you. France is Russia's ally, so France comes on the other end, and then it just goes on from there. And then Britain comes in when Belgium gets invaded. Again, we could spend a whole nother video on that stuff. But the war lasted for 4 years, and finally, in 1918, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, they end up collapsing. They lose the war. Now, what we're going to focus on more today is a little bit of the armistice that today is the original remembrance of, but I also want to discuss the very unjust treaty that comes about as a result of this war, the Treaty of Versailles. And we might ask, why do we need to look at the Treaty of Versailles? Well, there is a very, very straight line between the Treaty of Versailles that ends the war with Germany, because there were other treaties signed with the other powers, but this one focuses with Germany. There is a very, very clear and defined line between the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919 to World War II starting in September 1939. There's a very clear line here. Very, very clear, because this opens the door for Hitler, who himself was a veteran of this war. So we're going to go first. We're going to discuss a little bit of the armistice that today is. We will discuss the actual terms. I managed to find the terms of this, but then we're going to go piece by piece. I have managed to find information on the different articles of the Treaty of Versailles, of what they cover. And we're just kind of going to go through them, and we're going to really take a look at just how unjust this treaty was. This treaty was a victor's peace. There was absolutely no input from Germany. They weren't allowed to have input, and it's so harsh that you start reading through it and you start realizing, what the hell were we thinking? Because this only sets up another war, and we're going to discuss why. But anyways, in 1918, it proves to be the last year of the conflict for World War I, because the Central Powers, their economies start to collapse and their war efforts start to collapse as a result. Now, in early November, Germany is, by that time, the only Central Power that is left at war with the Allies, the German Empire, as it was at the time. It was still an empire. It was still ruled by a monarch, the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm. Now, it had the other allies, but Bulgaria ended up signing its own armistice on September 30th. The Ottoman Empire ended up signing an armistice on October 28th. And then Austria-Hungary, who by that point was already dissolving and breaking apart itself, the empire was pretty much gone, officially drew up a peace, an armistice with the Allies on November 4th. So by this point, by November 5th, Germany, the German Empire, is the only central power left in the fight, and it's very much on its last legs. The army has gotten beaten back. In the spring, the Germans had tried to do a spring offensive to try to break through the Western front lines, because they knew that with American troops soon to arrive in Europe, that was going to make it all that much harder to really win a war, especially with their exhausted and depleted numbers that they had. So they realized that the spring of 1918 was going to really be their last chance to try to win the war, and they failed. And then the American troops start arriving, and it just goes downhill from there. By this point, the Germans have been pushed out of France. They've been pushed mostly out of Belgium, and the Allies are nearing the German border, the actual German border. Now, that's also something significant here. In World War I, the Allies never actually invaded Germany. They never got into Germany. In World War II, they did. So by early November, Germany's the only one left. Well, events rapidly come to a turnaround on November 9th, a revolution starts sweeping through Germany. Revolution is spurned at home, starts in Berlin, and then it goes with the army. The army starts mutinying, they start deserting, they start giving up. And the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, he abdicates that day. Although in technicality it was his chancellor that announced his abdication, and the Kaiser would not officially abdicate on his own terms for another 2 weeks. But we take November 9th as the day that Wilhelm lost his power. So we'll say, for the sake of things, Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, abdicates on November 9th. And Germany is thrown into revolution with 2 rival governments. One, a socialist government set up by communists, and the other set up by the Social Democrats in the Reichstag as a democratic republic. So Germany's thrown into revolution, and now they have no Kaiser. The army's falling apart. There's disaster at home, and the German leaders, who are at least trying to exercise some control, urge that an immediate armistice with the Allies now needs to be found based on the 14 points of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had introduced in January of 1918 his 14 points for the war, for peace, and they were pretty lenient, they were pretty hopeful, and the Germans actually liked them themselves. So they argued, well, if we're going to seek an armistice, maybe we can actually get an armistice based on those points. If we can get one based on those points, we'll be more than happy to sign. Well, at this point, they go to the French, because the French are the ones that they're really having to fight the most against right now. It is the French territory that they invaded. They go directly to the French commander-in-chief, who is also the Allied Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Ferdinand Foch. And Marshal Foch is very much the hardline Frenchman. The French have been fighting for 4 years a war on their own soil in most cases, had lost, whole towns have been obliterated and wiped off the map. Sections of France turned into devastated wasteland and hell on earth. France is out for blood, because this has been fought on their soil. This was an invasion of their home. Their people have died the most out of any on the Western Front, at least in their eyes, and they are out for blood. So they are not willing to even consider the notion of a lenient peace with Germany. If Germany is going to ask for an armistice, it will be on French and British terms. No input from the Germans. And Foch very much gives them this idea, and he drafts an armistice basically out of his own head on who he claims are the Allied terms, but they're really the French terms and his terms. And the armistice terms are actually quite severe if we really look at them here. 104 years ago today, the armistice terms that Foch presented was a cessation of hostilities on the Western Front, all hostilities, all war on the Western Front, on that part where France down to Switzerland, Belgium, all that's going to come to an end. There will be a withdrawal of German forces from west of the Rhine River, which is in the western part of Germany. So that's in Germany. There will be an Allied occupation of the Rhineland area around the Rhine River. There will be the Germans must preserve all infrastructure in that area. They must also surrender all aircraft, warships, and military material. They cannot sabotage or destroy anything. Well, that will be seen as a breach of the armistice terms. They must release all Allied prisoners of war and all intern civilians, and they will have to pay eventual reparations. But there will be no such release on the Allied part of any German prisoners or a relaxation of the Allied naval blockade around Germany. And this is the terms that Foch presents. The German government is appalled by the armistice terms, and they actually asked Foch to reconsider some notions. And the only thing that Foch was willing to give was simply an extension of time for you to decide. Initially, he wanted 24 hours. And the Germans started complaining. He's like, okay, I'll give you 48. That's it. That's all I give you. He said, I'm not changing anything. And at one point, they're basically telling him, so show some humility. There's people dying right now. He's like, dying. You want to talk to me of dying? You invaded our land. I think you can go where that conversation probably would have gone along the lines. Foch was in no desire to have a lenient peace with the Germans, and he made this very clear at the armistice. If you want peace, if you honestly want to consider peace, you will sign this document no matter what I put down, and you will shut up and be quiet. Because admit, you have lost. You wouldn't be coming to me if you had not. And he knew that. He knew the Allies were in the ascending position, that the German resistance was collapsing, and that Germany was only basically trying to do this to save an invasion of its own country. So the German government, although they despise the armistice terms, they are faced with the prospect that if we don't sign it, the war goes on, the Allies enter Germany, they'll destroy Germany, and we're really in no position right now to continue a war effort. We have a revolution going on at home. So the German government that's in power, they decide, okay, we might not like it, but we're going to have to do this because there's no other option that is viable that saves Germany. So in Foch's train, they meet with Foch again on the morning of November 11th in Foch's train in the Compiègne forest, just a little bit off the Western Front. And at 5:45 a.m., the armistice is signed. The armistice will go into effect at 11 a.m., and this was actually an insistence of Foch, because his hope was that giving the Allied forces a couple more hours, since they were already on the move, could possibly allow them more time to grab as much territory as possible in case the armistice fell apart and the war resumed. The Allies would be in the best advantageous position to resume the war. So on this last day of fighting would occur until 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th month, well, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, as we commonly know. And sadly enough, on this very final day of fighting, 2,738 people still ended up dying. And I believe the last person killed was an American at literally 10:59. Literally not even a minute before the peace was about to take effect. I think he was shot by a sniper, if I remember reading right. So the war comes to an end at 11 a.m. and it's kind of odd because even watching the one film that came out on Netflix recently, the All Quiet on the Western Front iteration, where they've done that remake of it, they modified it so that it goes up to November 11th, which is not in the actual book, but for this purpose of this movie they did. And you just see how everything else, launched the last assault on that very morning. The armistice is about to take place in like not even 15 minutes. And, they're all fighting in these trenches, and then shortly after, Paul ends up getting bayoneted through the back. And he's pretty much got a mortal wound now. He's not dead yet, but he's going to be soon, because that's a mortal wound. Right, just like a couple seconds after that happens, someone blows the whistle, says war's over, and just everything goes quiet. It's ridiculous. But that did happen in some cases, that they were fighting until the very last minute, and it was ridiculous. There were German army commanders, like that film proposes, that were just in denial, didn't like the idea of an armistice. They still thought the army could win this, because the idea of the German army being beaten was unthinkable to them. So they argued, no, we're going to still do one last assault to try to reclaim territory. It was all in vain. But the armistice is signed and goes into effect. So there's now an armistice. So the war is not officially over, but there's no hostilities going on right now until a peace conference can be drawn to kind of dictate the terms of peace and develop a treaty for Germany to sign, to deal with. So the armistice actually ended up being extended 3 times in order to allow a peace treaty to actually be crafted. And until that would be until the official peace was signed. So the Paris Peace Conference, starts in Paris, France, and it starts to be held in January of 1919. And you have the Big Four, as we call them. In World War II, it's the Big Three, but in World War I, it's the Big Four. We have France, Georges Clemenceau, who's the Prime Minister. For Great Britain, you have the Prime Minister David Lloyd George. For Italy, you have Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. And then representing the United States, you have President Woodrow Wilson. Now, Germany was not invited in any way or shape or form to the conference and peace talks, and they would have no say in the talks at all. German representatives were not in any way invited to attend these at all. Russia was also not present, because the Russians had, the year before, the Tsar had been overthrown, and then the provisional Russian government had been overthrown that October by Lenin and his Bolshevik communists. So Russia was no longer in the war, because that March in 1918, Lenin had actually signed a separate peace with Germany. Although the Allies did at least reverse that treaty and cause the Germans to have to renounce any gains, renounce that treaty as invalid, and though they did seemingly help Lenin with that, they still were launching military expeditions into Russia to help anti-revolutionary forces fight the Bolsheviks. So Russia was no longer in the war, and B, the Allies were kind of against it now, because now the people in power were people they did not like. Now, each of the big four powers came into the conference with their own demands and aims. France was perhaps the biggest. France had fought, as we mentioned, war had taken place on French soil. French towns and cities had been destroyed, bombed, civilians killed. France is the most pissed at Germany. It is out for blood in this peace. It wants Germany crippled as a result, because it does not want Germany to ever have the chance to invade it again. Yeah, how well did that work out in 1940? But France essentially wants to defang Germany, and it demands massive reparations payments, because there's going to be a lot of rebuilding that's going to take place after the war. The French economy is exhausted by the war, so where are you going to get the money to pay for these rebuildings and reconstruction that's going to have to happen after the war? Well, to the French. Germany started this war with us, so they're paying for it. Italy desired territory, which France had also desired territory. France desired the return of Alsace-Lorraine, 2 French provinces that Germany had taken as a result of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. They had 1870, but it ended in 71. Anyway, they had taken those 2 provinces, and France had never really gotten over the loss of those two provinces, and they constantly wanted them back, and they put that demand into the peace talks. Italy was desiring territory, mostly at Austria-Hungary's expense, and it wanted increased standing among the other 2 powers. It was kind of seen as the junior among them. Britain wished something to the contrary of France, and this set them aside. They actually wanted to rebuild Germany, because they viewed Germany as a very valuable trading partner and couldn't imagine losing the trade with Germany if the German economy went to crap. which it already was going there, and it would. In fact, we're going to have some artifacts related to that here at the end of the video. And then the U.S. The U.S. is rejecting pretty much all of the territorial claims of the other European nations, saying we're not going to talk about dividing up the spoils of war right now. That is not what we're going to do this for. And they want a peace based on the 14 points that President Wilson had explained. Of course, Italy, France, and Britain, they're not really for the 14 points. And although the U.S. is acknowledged as being there and did help end the war, there's also the view among those powers that the U.S. just kind of trumped in here at the very last minute and really didn't do much. I mean, they helped us, yes, and we did win the war, but they came in here at the very last minute. They had hardly any casualties compared to what we have suffered over 4 years. And the war wasn't even in our home. So there is that view that the Americans are a little bit naive at the conference among the European powers. But eventually, a peace treaty is developed, the Treaty of Versailles, as the conference was held at the old Versailles estate of the French kings of the old days, and that is just outside of Paris. And in June, Germany was presented with the Treaty of Versailles to sign. So we've gotten a peace treaty officially developed by the Allies. So this is where the main heart of this video I wanted to kind of go over, and this is going to go through what each of the articles really did. And it is kind of ridiculous. And this is where we're going to see that this sets up another war. Because all these terms, remember, Germany was given absolutely no option to help negotiate in this conflict at all. They were given no option to negotiate the peace. They were given no representation at the peace conference. And pretty much it was, okay, we developed this treaty, here you go. There is going to be no negotiations, no changing to the treaty. You figuratively have a gun pointed to your head and says you're going to sign on the dotted line or else. Or else I'm going to pull the trigger, right, meaning I'm going to invade. And that was what Germany's facing. Either sign the treaty or go back to war. So right here are the terms, and this might take us a little bit, but we're going to get through them. So Articles 40 to 45 state that Germany must turn over coal mines in the Saar Basin to France, but they would be an official League of Nations mandate. The League of Nations is something that comes out of this, so I better explain that first. It was basically a predecessor to the United Nations. It was a body council made up of all the world powers that had representatives in there to try to peacefully solve differences. The problem is, unlike the United Nations, it had no teeth. It could condemn things, but it could not really respond to things. And this was actually the only one of the 14 points of President Wilson that actually got incorporated into the treaty. But at the end of the war, the United States Senate never ratified the treaty, so we had to make our own separate peace treaty with Germany because the Senate would not ratify it. And on top of that, the United States never joined the League of Nations, and that also contributed to World War II. But that's, again, another topic for another video. We're focusing on the punishments that it gave Germany. So Germany must turn over all the coal mines in the Saar Basin to France, all their coal mines in one of their own regions to France for France's use for a period of 15 years. And after those 15 years are up, there will be a vote that will be held in those lands to determine whether or not they want to remain with Germany or if they want to become part of France. With France being very hopeful they would join them. Never happened. But this is going to take resources away from Germany because Germany needs coal. It needs coal to fuel its war machine, and this is something else that's going to happen. Article 51, Alsace-Lorraine is returned to France. That will no longer be part of the German Empire, or Germany at this point. There is no empire. Articles 42 through 44 and Article 180 all say that the Germans will dismantle all fortifications on the Rhine River, pretty much on their western border along France, and the Rhineland is now going to be a demilitarized zone. There will be no military forces or fortifications or anything of a military nature allowed in the lands around the Rhine River. So this pretty much prevents Germany from remilitarizing like they had before the war there, and it also opens up a very big impossible invasion route for France. If France ever deemed that, okay, I'm just going to invade Germany, their entire western border by treaty is supposed to be demilitarized, so France would have absolutely no opposition just stomping through Western Germany. It opens a French invasion of Germany very plausible. In Article 80, Germany and Austria are forbidden to unify. Now, this eventually was something that Hitler, of course, famously did in defiance of in 1938 with the Anschluss. And the reason that as we mentioned, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had fallen apart. Austria, by this point, is its own nation, and like the Germans, they are a German-speaking people. So they share a common language and culture. And there was very much talks in Germany and Austria of simply unifying with each other in order to preserve some kind of power. And the Allies realized this pretty quick, and for whatever reasons, they were terrified of such a union. They said, nope, you are forbidden to ever unify with Austria. That's not happening. Articles 81 through 86, Germany will renounce all territorial claims and recognize the independence of Czechoslovakia, a new state that had been set up for the Czechs and the Slovaks in Central Eastern Europe. This was part of the nation-building thing that comes out of the end of World War I. We have three big nations, really, in Europe that come about. We have Poland, we have Czechoslovakia, and then we have Yugoslavia as well, that kind of come about as a result of this war from the former lands of the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. So Germany has to give up all territorial claims and recognize the independence of Czechoslovakia. Now, eventually, Hitler had problems with that because, as we know, some of these lands were German, had German ethnicity. Nope, you're part of Czechoslovakia now. We're just punishing Germany. That's going to very much set the tone for Hitler to invade the Sudetenland in 1938, claiming that there's a high percentage of ethnic Germans living in those territories, which he wasn't wrong in some cases. Articles 87 through 93, German West Prussia and other ethnic German territories will be given to Poland. So Germany had this little enclave of what used to be part of the Kingdom of Prussia, and it had like Königsberg was the old Prussian capital, where a lot of the Prussian monarch's home was. Went up along the Baltic. Well, they wanted to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea access, maritime access. So to do that, they take a little chunk that divides this little part over here from the rest of Germany, and this little chunk right here, this little stretch of the little finger, I guess, that goes out this way, they take like the middle out of that and give that to Poland. So now Germany's over here, and then has like this little enclave that's cut off from the rest of it over here, which is nowadays, I think, pretty much where Kaliningrad is, that Russian enclave in Europe. In fact, Kaliningrad was Königsberg. The Russians simply renamed it after taking it in World War II, and then they got to keep it. But Germany is going to lose land to, basically, in Pomerania, to Poland. Takes land away. In fact, Germany lost a total of roughly 10% of its territory in Europe as a result of this war, of this treaty. Article 119. Germany will be stripped of all colonies in China and Africa. They will be allowed to have no colonies left. They will be divided up between the French and the British, and maybe even the Italians. This comes pretty much as an insult to Germany because Germany had spent so much time in the late 19th century trying to carve out a colonial empire of its own, because at that time it was seen that in order to be a great European power, you had to have an empire. And they saw colonies as a symbol of a great European power. So to not have that empire was like hurtful to them. It was outright humiliating to lose all their colonies that they had. So that was pretty much done. And plus, Germany and Britain and France were nothing but greedy when it came to colonial empire. So they just wanted all the land for themselves. Articles 159 and 160 through 163. This is where they pretty much neuter the German military, because the biggest fear is that Germany's going to remilitarize and, start again and possibly win. So the Allies take specific steps here to ensure that Germany can never be another viable military threat again. And the first thing that they do this, and I mean, when we go through these, really think about how ridiculous these numbers are, and how just not ridiculous. I'm trying to think of another word here. Insufficient these would be for any nation. Germany's army is limited to a maximum of only 100,000 troops. If you go over that, you're in violation of the treaty. The army is to be used for defense only. which is quite a shock. Because think, Germany's now limited to an army of only 100,000, when at one time, prior to the start of the war, the German army numbered at 1.9 trillion. That is a very massive reduction. And on top of that, to make it even more complicated, artillery and engineers are also going to be limited, and even your officer corps. In the old Imperial Germany, the officer corps, or the German High Command, was one of the main commanding things of the German military, and it was a very prestigious organization and command structure, and there were literally probably over 1 million members of that command structure because of how large the German army was. Now the officer corps is going to be limited to no more than 4,000. Ridiculous. On Articles 164 through 172, the German military is disarmed. They even limited how much ammunition the Germans could have for their rifles, for their guns, for anything that they fire. They could only have, like, even artillery shells here. I actually have the number for artillery shells, and this is just freaking ridiculous. For small artillery, Germany was only allowed to have 1,500 shells. For big artillery, 500 shells. That's all you get. You go over that, you're in violation. You cannot have tanks. You might have developed tanks late in the war because you copied the British, but nope, you can't have tanks now. That's not allowed. War material for the Germans that is allowed can only be manufactured in a few small factories that the Allies have approved and are kind of monitoring. And this is going to set the stage for the Allies just really don't want any chance of Germany doing another war again, so they think that, oh, if we do this, there's no way that's going to happen. Articles 181 and 197, I'm sure this came as a very, very big thing to the Kaiser, who by this point is now in exile in the Netherlands. The German Navy will be limited to 6 battleships, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and you are not allowed to have a single submarine, because during the war, the German U-boats had been the most destructive thing on the high seas. So the Allies made very sure in the peace that, no, we don't want those things. They were successful, so no, they can't have any submarines. They can have battleships, destroyers, torpedo boats, but they can only have this many, and you're not allowed to have any submarines. The Kaiser had spent, since the 1890s, building up a German navy to challenge Britain. He loved the German navy that he was building. It was his navy. That had to come as a very big blow to him personally, I'm sure. Germany is also prevented in Articles 198 through 202. Germany is prohibited from having any sort of an air force, and Zeppelins, the big blimps, they're banned because during the war the Germans actually used Zeppelins to bomb cities in Britain and France. Except they were not like nowadays. They would literally have to drop a bomb by hand over the gondola and drop it. It didn't do much damage, but it was terrifying. They are only allowed to have 100 seaplanes only for the purpose of minesweeping. That's it. You're not allowed to have an air force. Your navy is going to be limited. Your army is only going to be 100,000. You can have very few officers. You can only have so much ammunition. This neuters the German army. It neuters the German military, and it's just absolutely egregious. Articles 227 and 230. The Allies are authorized to conduct war crime trials of Germans or Central Powers Authority figures, military leaders, that will be on a 5-judge tribunal that will also put Kaiser Wilhelm II on trial for a supreme offense against international morality and sanctity of treaties. The Allies wanted to try German officials and German military leaders and other political leaders for war crimes, for the war. And the one most sought out after figure that they wanted was Kaiser Wilhelm. Of course, they did not ever get to do that because the Kaiser had fled to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands was very much they were neutral during the war. They actually stayed out of it. So when the Allies made the demand to the Netherlands that please hand us over the Kaiser so we can try him for war crimes, the Netherlands said, no, because he's living in exile here and we've granted him asylum. So Wilhelm actually lived in the Netherlands until the very end of his life. In June of 1941, he died. He was actually living in like a small country mansion or whatever it was. Hewish Dorn, I think, is what they call it. But the Netherlands literally refused to hand over Wilhelm to the Allies, and so they never got to try him as a war criminal. Which that was very much politically motivated, because there is really the question of how involved the Kaiser was at one point, and that could be a whole nother video, because it was very much for a lot of the war, the German high command was calling the shots, and the Kaiser was just kind of there to give his rubber stamp to everything. Especially in 1917 onwards, when it was more Hindenburg and Ludendorff who were really calling everything, and the Kaiser was just there. But overall, 17 Germans did manage to get put on trial by the Allies, but not any of them got executed, and all 17 got light sentences or they were acquitted entirely. So they were not like the war crime trials that we would see after World War II, such as the ones at Nuremberg, where you would see the execution of certain officials. Then we come to the most egregious and final article, that this is really going to set why World War II happens. I mean, the military thing's one thing, because that's going to make Germans feel like they can't defend themselves in the case of an attack or something like that. And it's going to definitely humiliate them. But this last one is going to make Germans everywhere upset to the point that they're literally pissed off to the Allies to no end, and they would very much go back to war. And that is Article 231. Often what it's called is the War Guilt Clause, and this explicitly states Germany accepts all responsibility for causing all the loss and damage inflicted on the Allies, and will pay reparations payments for damages and losses ensued. Basically, Germany, even though Austria-Hungary was the one that started the war, Germany gets all the blame for starting the war. This wasn't in any way, it was not in any way Austria-Hungary, it wasn't in any way Serbia, it wasn't in any way France, it wasn't in any way Britain, it wasn't in any way Russia. No, it's all Germany's fault. All Germany. No one else. Even though everyone was kind of guilty, but because Germany had lost, they get all the blame. So, yeah, it's entirely, it is entirely your fault, and you are going to pay us massive money in reparations to make up for all the losses and damages that we have suffered through 4 years of warfare. That was France's demand right there. France got its way again. And Germany was eventually, the amount was eventually set for reparations payments in 1920, and the amount was set at $33 billion, which in today's money is $423 billion. Yeah, no, no. I'm not paying you that much money when I didn't even start the war in the first place. Now, this also came at a really bad time, and part of the reason why this was so disliked by the Germans is because the German economy was already in very, very big trouble, because during the war, the imperial government had printed lots of currency while borrowing heavily, and they had taken the gold standard, the gold backing of their currency off during the war in order to use it for the war effort. So the money during the war was no longer being backed by precious metals, and thus, there was a whole lot of it. They printed off more than they needed. So what's that going to lead to? Massive inflation. Kind of what we're seeing right now here in the United States, but on a much larger and more dangerous scale. So the German government at the end of the war is already, got the problem where their economy's not doing so great, because they've got a lot of money borrowed out. They got a lot of money printed off. It's not worth a whole lot. They got a massive debt to different people that they still have to pay because they bought stuff during the war in order to fund it. So that wasn't helping. And the Weimar government that's set up in Germany, the Weimar Republic that replaces the empire, they're struggling to make payments on the debt, and they end up actually defaulting on payments in gold, in the gold-backed marks after the war. They end up going into default because the economy is so wrecked they can't afford to keep up in the payments to fund this off. As a response, France, in its infinite wisdom, decides that they're going to occupy the industrial Ruhr region in Germany in 1922 to try to force those payments to resume, which they hope, Germany will have to pay us now, because now, basically, okay, you're not going to pay up, fine, I'm going to seize this from you until you start paying up. Not having any kind of sympathy that perhaps this is because we're asking them to pay too damn much, And you got the problem where they don't have the economy to pay for what we want them to pay. Where did that just go? So this leads to, in 1923, the German economy actually goes into hyperinflation. So the French taking away industrial and agricultural regions from them, that's not going to help the problem. That's just going to take away more sources of money that they really need right now. So hyperinflation hits in 1923, and this is like inflation gone berserk. That's what hyperinflation essentially is. And we're going to show you here how bad this got. I have with me some coins and a paper thing. Now this is, don't know if you can see it, that's the old Hohenzollern, the imperial symbol of Germany, of the imperial family of Kaiser Wilhelm. It's on all the old Dutch Reich coins from the German Empire. This is a German Empire imperial mark from 1901. It even says Dutch Reich. You can probably see it. This is 1 mark. This is a standard unit of German currency back in the day. Now they use euros, but they used marks up until the euro was adopted. But this was gold back then. This is actually silver. This one is. This is actually a silver coin. Because back then, they could afford to back it up with metals. So this was before the war, of course. This is 1901. That's silver-made 1 mark coin from the German Empire. This one is still got the old imperial crest, but it's actually a 1919. So by this point, the monarchy is gone. The German government, though, is in so much chaos, they really haven't had a chance to really redesign the currency yet. So this is the last year you're going to find imperial stuff. So this is 1919. I think it says it over here. And this is a half mark from 1919. So this is during the peace treaty is being signed and everything. I don't know if that came in real clear. It might. But anyway, but this before the war would have been silver, just like this mark would have been. It's not silver anymore because of the imperial government taking that out. It's now copper. It's copper nickel based crap. But these would have been it. Now, of course, this probably wouldn't have been half a mark in 1919, but this was the old mark. You used to be able to put it on a coin, and this was a mark, and it was silver. By 1923, keep in mind that just 20 years prior, we had a mark coin that was made out of silver, was 1 coin. That was 1 mark. By 1923, I got this little thing that is light as hell. It's made out of zinc, so it's light. It almost don't even feel like a coin. And this is from the Weimar government. It's even got like Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit. They're one of their things in their anthem on this. But this is 1923, and this is 200 marks. Yeah, this is supposed to be this little zinc thing that weighs almost nothing. It feels like a fake little piece of metal that you could probably bend. I could probably bend it if I bent it. I literally could, like aluminum. This is supposed to be 200 of these. That 20 years ago, 200 silver coins. That's how worthless the money's getting at this point. That you can supposedly hold 200 marks in that small of a coin. To make it worse, here's 1922. This is a banknote for 1,000 marks, and this literally don't even cost $10 to get because there were so many of these because the money was so worthless that people were taking stacks of these out of the bank, coming home with them, and it was so worthless that they were using them as building blocks or wallpaper. That people were posting these as wallpaper because it was so worthless. You could come home with a wheelbarrow of the crap, and you could not even buy a newspaper. It got that bad. At one point, I believe they said that it took at least 4 trillion marks to even get to $1 US. It was that bad. This money was absolutely worthless. There was no trying to spend this. But this was a consequence of the inflation that had happened during the war and the fact that the Allies were imposing these massive reparations payments on Germany that they could not afford to make. Now, the U.S. did try to lend money eventually to Germany to try to help it repay its reparations payments, but by that point, what's the point? Because now we're funding the reparations payments. So in 1932, they end up canceling the reparations payments altogether. Although Germany did, after World War II, agree to pay some of it in addition to the reparations they had to pay after World War II, and they did not pay that off fully until 2010. That's ridiculous. So the economy is going to be placed in pretty much shit for the rest of its tenure. If the economy is going to be placed into absolute disaster for the foreseeable future, how do you think that's going to impact the German people? The German people aren't going to be able to do anything. They're going to be at a very disadvantaged position. And many Germans at home, they don't even believe that Germany lost the war. They believe that they were cheated somehow, that they could have still won it because they had been lied to by the government. The government had told them, oh, yeah, we're winning. And then this happens. And many people are caught off guard, like, wait a minute. We were just told we were winning. How did we lose? There's a lot of people and they rightfully are upset at the economic conditions. They're upset at the already bad thing that they got their military neutered, so they can't really defend themselves. And they're upset because the Allies are saying, oh yeah, you started the war. No German in Germany was willing to accept that they were the sole cause of the war. That was one of the big reasons they hated that treaty. But nonetheless, the German government really doesn't have a choice. It's either sign the treaty or go back to war. And they can't go back to war. They are not in a position to resume a war. So despite their misgivings, on June 28th, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles and the Hall of Mirrors, the same place where the German Empire had been proclaimed on January 18th of 1871. It was kind of an insult. So that's going to set the stage here throughout the 1920s. Germany's economic condition is horrible, and then we all know what hits in 29, the Great Depression. And we talk about how bad it was here in the United States. Well, we had a booming economy in the 1920s. Germany was struggling throughout the 1920s. So how bad do you think they had it? They were already screwed over. And to put it bluntly, it was worse. It was far worse. So it's kind of ridiculous. And that's going to set the stage for Hitler. Hitler is going to prey on the insecurity and the problems and the hatred that the German people have after World War I. He's going to prey on that, telling them he can provide the way that is better. He can provide the better way forward and get Germany out of this slump. And that is exactly what the German people believe he can do. Of course, Hitler pretty much burns this treaty. But I have here, before we kind of close out with this is a copy of the Kaiser's memoirs that he wrote in exile after he abdicated. Not real thick, but it's definitely full of stuff. Of his writings on his beliefs during his reign and during the war. But I'm want to pull here that Wilhelm actually, although he was in exile, he still followed affairs in Germany. And when he actually comes here and talks about his hopes for a Versailles reaction right here. And I just want to read it out of here because his views, I think, are somewhat reflective of everyone that was German at that time. As he states, and this is in his own words, meanwhile, things have changed, the barriers between nations have fallen, and gradually they are awakening to the realization of how their confidence was imposed upon. The reaction will be crushing to the makers of the Versailles Peace, but helpful to Germany. It goes without saying that among the statesmen, politicians, and publicists of the Entente who really know, not a single one is really convinced of Germany's guilt in having caused the World War. Every one of them knows the real interrelation of events, and assuredly there never was a case where so many augurs smiled at each other over a secret held in common as the case of the responsibility for the World War. In fact, one may even speak of a chorus of such individuals, since 28 nations took part in the war against Germany. But in the long run, not even the shrewdest augurs will suffice to make world history. Truth will make its way forward, and thus Germany will come into her right. The various stipulations of the Versailles Treaty are in themselves null and void, and since they can be observed neither by the Entente nor by Germany, it has been possible for months to note that what difficulties are arising in the path not only of Germany, but of the victors as a result of such an extravagant instrument. In many ways, the treaty has been punctured by the Entente itself, and for this the reason is easily found. In the present highly developed state of the world, which rests upon free systematic exchange of material and intellectual property, regulated solely by production itself, it is quite out of the question for three men, no matter how eminent they may be, to sit themselves down anywhere and dictate paragraph laws to the world. Yet that is what the Versailles Treaty does, not only for Germany, but also indirectly for the Entente and America, since all economic questions can be solved by mutual, not one-sided action. The life of nations is regulated always, and most particularly in our day, not by paragraphs, but by simply and solely by the needs of nations. It is possible, to be sure, to do violence to those national needs temporarily by the imposition of arbitrary decisions, but in such cases both parties concerned must suffer. The world is in such a stage just now. Conditions like those at present cannot last. Not guns, nor tanks, nor squadrons of airplanes can perpetuate them. Therefore, their removal has already begun. For if the Peace of Versailles were really such a judicious and unimpeachable instrument bringing blessings upon the world, there would not be constant need of new conferences, discussions, and meetings having to do with this marvelous document. The constant necessity for new interpretations is due indeed to the fact that the needs of highly cultivated and civilized nations were not taken into account when the peace was concluded. One must not be pharisaical, however. Up to a certain point, the extravagance of the terms imposed by the victor after a life and death struggle is a natural consequence of the relief felt at having escaped alive from deadly danger. Nonetheless, I know that Germany, if we had emerged victorious from the war, would have imposed quite different terms that would have been just and endurable. The peace treaties of Brest-Litovsk and Bucharest, which indeed are not at all comparable with the Treaty of Versailles, cannot be adduced against us. They were concluded in the very midst of the war and had to include conditions which would guarantee our safety until the end of the war. Had it come to a general peace, the treaty made by us in the East would have had a far different aspect, but we won the war. Had we won the war, it would have been revised by ourselves. At the time it was made, it was necessary to give preference to military requirements, but enlightenment regarding the unjust Treaty of Versailles is on the way, and the necessities life among present-day nations will speak in imperious tones to victors and vanquished. After years of the heaviest trial will come the liberation from a yoke imposed unjustly upon a great, strong, honest nation. Then every one of us will be glad and proud again that he is a German. Wilhelm pretty much, even in his statement where the Allies argued that, Germany argues, like, why are you having such a harsh peace on us? And they're like, well, you had a very harsh peace on Russia and Romania when they dropped out of the war, when you beat Romania, when Russia dropped out. And Kaiser Wilhelm is basically saying there's like, yes, they were harsh, but it was in the middle of a war and we were serving military requirements. So that was probably not what you should have gone off of for a peace treaty, because had there been a general peace, that is not the terms that we would have drawn up. At least that's in his words, it wasn't going to be. But I honestly question if that would have happened or not. But in his words, he's basically questioning the validity of the Treaty of Versailles, if it really is a just treaty or if it's just some kind of bombastic lie, which it pretty much was. It remains, in my opinion, probably one of the worst treaties ever made in human history, because it sets the stage directly. As some American lawmakers and commanders even said, this isn't a peace, this is a 20-year armistice that eventually will go back to war, and we did. But anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to discuss here today. I just wanted to kind of cover that because of the anniversary today of it, and it's something we had not gone over that I felt was important. So that kind of wraps it up for today. Of course, it is Veterans Day, so if you see a veteran, thank them for their service. Thank them for their duty to their country that they performed admirably, I'm sure. Thank them for all the work and help that they have done to our country for their service. Thank them for that. But I think that pretty much concludes for today, so I don't know when we'll be back on here, hopefully soon, but we'll get to it when we get to it, I guess. So, So, as always, any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section below. If you're finding yourself coming back and watching the videos, make sure that you are subscribing. If you find yourself coming back quite frequently, it probably would help you stay more in tune. But again, I cannot make anyone, and I don't want to make anybody. But I'm just saying. But anyways, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their weekend, a good rest of their week, a good Veterans Day, and hopefully everyone remains well. So until next time, God bless you all.